Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today it is the 18th of June, and we're looking at advances recorded near the border between Donetsk and Dnipro, including a deep Russian penetration into another village. We're going to look at advances near Mirin on the Pokrovsk front, along with Chasiv Yar. There's another update from there, a Russian entrance into Serebryonka for the first time, and we'll look at a substantial advance in between the Kursk and Sumy regions. So that's going to be really a culmination of advances that have been building up over the past few days. And I want to look at the Ukrainian Army Corps system because an additional Army Corps, the first one within the territorial defense unit system, has been introduced, the 21st Army Corps. So we're going to look at the state of Ukraine's reshuffling of their units and whether it's actually having an impact and it's a good idea. Let's zoom in over here, and you can see that the Russians have been able to advance yet another 3.5 square kilometers. And soon I will add in a blue polygon to indicate Ukraine's control over Dnipro Oblast now that it's becoming relevant. But for the time being, you can see over here the Russian gain marked with the yellow polygon. The Russians were able to advance about 5 kilometers. And yet again, we're not seeing a large increase in the amount of vehicular assaults. To the contrary, we're seeing a gradual decline in the amount of vehicles being used along this part of the front line. Now, there are exceptions depending on certain variables whenever an opportunity does present itself, and it could actually be used to conduct a rapid advance and to suppress Ukrainian fire in a certain dugout or tree line position, then it has certain utility. But in a lot of these advances, we're seeing the Russians utilizing buggies and motorcycles, and not many of them, only a couple of them in certain cases, to go across large swaths of open fields and then to seep themselves into villages, into the basements of some of these locations. And then it's all just a matter of ensuring that there is a steady supply of reinforcements and movement back and forth without, FPVs harassing the forces and the vehicles on the way back and forth, obviously. And we're reaching the point where the Russians have been able to do this to a really, really deep degree. We're looking at infiltrations and penetrations that span like 12 kilometers away from where a more structured, a more clear part of the front line would be situated, that would just sort of run along Oleksivka all the way to the area north of Rodrodny. But to the contrary, the Russian forces have been able to push the mantle much, much farther into Ukrainian territory in southern Donetsk and arrive at the village of Zaporizhia over here. It is relatively small, and the eastern chunk has already been occupied. So it really is just a matter of being able to hold on and then eventually squeezing the Ukrainians out. It also means that the Russian forces are now only 1.3 kilometers away from reaching the Vovch River and by extension the border with Dnipro from this particular location. And so the perimeter along which the Russians could actually cross over is beginning to increase, and we're seeing two distinct salients forming. First is the one over here, sandwiched in between the Zaporizhia advance and the Russian capture of Komar over the past week. So this area is a bit smaller than the other salients we're going to look at. But yet again, you have small squads of Ukrainian forces, I would presume from the 23rd Brigade to a certain degree, and then also from TDF forces like the 123rd Territorial Defense Brigade. Very small quantities of soldiers holding on to whatever dugouts were actually created and constructed over the period of time when the Russians were approaching these positions, and then whatever foliage remains on some of these tree lines. That would be the protection that the Ukrainians have, and then they get FPV coverage to try to stop advancing Russians from overrunning their positions. But then again, this is only a sort of transient response and can't be kept up or sustained for a long period of time. It's all about just buying that extra time slot that will allow the Ukrainians, the vast majority of the Ukrainians that are on the rear, to build up and prepare for the next line of defense that I've talked about now for several videos, running along the Mokryali River. That would include Peribudova, which is in serious danger due to the capture of Komar. But further north than that, you have other villages that are running along this highway and then sort of extend northeastwards. So Zirka, Tolstoy, all these villages that were completely out of the purview just a couple of weeks ago, they are really small. They're not well defended. And so for a large Russian garrison of a battalion, for instance, involved in offensive activity to push through into these areas and then dispatch, I don't know, a couple of squads, that would be sufficient to enter into some of these hamlets. And we just don't have an indication yet of Ukraine's defensive gumption in some of these locations. It actually does remind me of the scale of some of the villages that are located in this sort of liminal space between Selidove and the border with Dnipro and Donetsk. So, to Ukraine's credit, in these areas, in these open fields, and the sort of scattered villages around here, they were actually able to put up a fight and drag out the clashes for an extended period of time. And that was able to just sort of prevent the Russians from immediately reaching the border and then beginning to harass areas like Novopavlivka. But this situation is different due to, the smaller size. These villages are actually even smaller than the ones that we were talking about further to the northeast, and the pace at which the Russians are advancing over here is also larger. So keep an eye for the salient because it does have the potential to just sort of cave in on itself, and then you're looking at like another 15 square kilometers of territory being immediately marked as a yellow polygon. Likewise, over here you have another one of these salients. Look, I'm gonna circle its perimeter over here. It includes largely open fields, some tree lines and ravines, but also sort of the northern outskirts approaches to Zeleny Kut, Novokrainka, Oleksivka, and it's completely reasonable for the Ukrainians to remain situated over here with small squads because it prevents the Russians from creating a unified front that runs along the Dnipro-Donetsk border, actually crosses over the. You have various layers of defense over here, but they're all part of the same line. So you don't have a secondary line nearby necessarily. It's just crossing over whatever Dragon's Teeth may be there and then the anti-tank ditch. But after that point, it's just open season until you arrive at the highway and more generally the approaches of Novopavlivka, meaning that this area is extremely exposed because you don't have that many minefields around here. So from a vehicular perspective or from a motorcycle buggy perspective, those can be utilized on foot. Obviously, the anti-tank ditch can be just crossed over without causing any sort of damage or hampering the pace of the attack. And then from there, there aren't really sufficient defenses. There may be a sufficient amount of manpower in this area because of the large redeployment to try to prevent deeper infiltrations south of Novopavlivka, but the actual defenses and really, quite frankly, organization points, staging hubs for Ukrainian forward defensive vanguard forces, they aren't readily available around here because you don't have many fortresses and you don't have many frontline villages that can be used to house these soldiers and basements. All you have is Novopavlivka itself. But the Ukrainians will want to avoid this town becoming the epicenter of fighting. They would have much preferred for there to be a clash going on in an area that's, maybe 10 kilometers away, which has happened with a lot of these other similar sized villages in areas where they actually did have some sort of protection on the outer rings. But the situation is completely different over here. And the only village that sort of would mimic this sort of role of serving as a battlefield that could sort of just drag out and turn into a slogfest. Horikovo is the closest thing the Ukrainians have, but the Russians are already entering into it and taking over its environs. So over here, 2.3 square kilometers of territory captured south of the village. And this is a video from June 18th of the 35th Marine Brigade destroying a Russian buggy as it was moving, really running parallel to this anti-tank ditch, which then actually connects perpendicularly to the vertical line that you see along the border, which again has not really displayed much efficacy, but you can see how it was built along the map. Now I want to zoom in on Mirin, so you can see over here the Russians have been able to enter into the village from Malinivka. This indicates an advance of zero point 0.7 square kilometers of territory, and it is a relatively small hamlet. It's essentially just one road that runs horizontally, and you could argue that this southern road is a part of Malinivka that's now been fully taken over by the Russian side. And just by extension, by utilizing this paved road, the Russians can actually push even deeper. And after Mirin, there is no obstacle. There aren't any major trench positions that have been recorded, nor are there populated areas. Besides, of course, this pond over here, and I suppose the ravines, tree lines, there aren't any obstacles before reaching Novoekonomichny, which is an important village. It's relatively large, and arriving at that area would render Ukrainian defenses along the salient, really exposed, they'd be susceptible to just completely caving in on themselves. So a Ukrainian withdrawal would really be the only option left for the garrison located in this area at that point, which would straighten out the front line and allow the Russians to unify with the garrison in Mirin that took it over a couple of months ago, and then from there attack towards Mykolaievka and Novokonomishny. And those villages are actually on lower elevation. They're basically running along the Treta River, so the Russians would be able to obviously take advantage of their elevation advantage to a certain degree, because obviously on the western side of the riverbank, the Ukrainians have extremely high vantage points located in Pokrovsk and Mirin. But on the flip side, as we've noted many times, the Russians would also have their own sort of ridge that runs east of the river valley, including areas over here that have to be captured, and then also the salient that the Ukrainians are currently defending. And that's a part of the logic behind the steadfast defense of the Ukrainians in this particular location. They want to deny the Russians a geographic asset in this sort of local scene of fighting. But when you look at the layout of trenches, it's not built to defend the entrances into these two villages, meaning that the Russians could then begin to seep in and from there begin to actually undermine one of the outer layers of the Pokrovsk Munirad agglomeration and the defenses to the east. And again, all with the objective of then arriving at this really, really important higher elevated slag heap that gives a great line of sight into Munirad itself. So that's part of the Russian calculus as well. Zooming in on Toretsk, two advances over here, one north of the Lifka, and there are two Lifkas around here. So the one that's closer to Krimske and the Toretsk area, there was a Russian advance recorded around here amounting to 1.7 square kilometers of territory. So from June 17th, the Curtin Company unit, which is a part of the 28th Mechanized Brigade, they worked in tandem with other parts of the 28th Brigade, including the Sapalach drone units and the 3rd Battalion. So they conducted numerous FPV strikes onto Russian forces operating in dugouts near this small pond and near some of the tree lines, the windbreaks running along this rail line. Basically, any sort of defensive position that the Ukrainians earlier may have constructed that now the Russians are seizing, those are being struck by Ukrainian drone crews that are extremely active around here, because you're not really seeing that many armored assaults. It's more so just Russian forces trying to seep into open areas and really just fighting, coming down to taking over certain tree lines. That's become a major objective in this area. And you could see how, due to some of these Russian infiltrations that are very targeted on advancing along certain lines, maybe the line is just a route that could be viewed as conducive for taking over certain fortifications or entering into a certain village or dacha, something of the sorts. It also creates the possibility for a lot of salients to form, which the Ukrainians are unwilling to give up easily, but it also sort of creates a situation wherein the Russians are not really required to overrun every single square inch of territory. They can focus on areas that they view as most strategic and just continue doubling down on their infiltration. Even if the flanks are exposed, the Ukrainians don't have the capacity to actually threaten those flanks from the ground. They could obviously threaten it using drones, and that's what we're seeing in a lot of this footage. A lot of Russian casualties are caused by drones in this area. I'd say almost exclusively they're caused by drones, and besides that, probably just artillery. So as a result, the Ukrainians that are involved in defending across the entire front line, the entire northern perimeter of Toretsk, they get pinned down in these salients and they refuse to withdraw due to not wanting to cause a major correction to the front line. And then it diverts forces away from the deeper infiltrations of the Russian side and eventually leads to a situation where the flanks of the salient are really closing in on it and leave no other choice but for an sort of organized withdrawal before the situation becomes hectic. So we've seen this repeated so many times in Toretsk, and now you can see how it's really beginning to manifest itself once again just to the north. You can see it over here with the sort of salient leading into the slag heap. You can see it over here with another salient through open fields and trenches, and once again near the Donbass Canal. So there are three examples in close proximity. You could also see that the Russians entered into the other Lifka and they captured 1.6 square kilometers of territory in that process. So you have the 5th Rifle Battalion Tokil unit they conducted FPV strikes and grenade drops onto infantry as they were entering into the Lifka. That's from June 14th. And from June 18th, we have an update indicating that this advance was not just a one off. They were able to stay over here and build up upon that success over the course of 4 days. So the Phoenix Regiment, they hit a Russian dugout near the Lifka. And once again, that shows us that now they have the option to continue pushing forward into the houses and into the nearby farming warehouses. And that's just an update on the situation southeast of Konstantinivka, with the bigger picture being the Russians want to attack and enter into this Bilohora line from two directions, one coming along this rail line and then branching off into it, and the other coming from the Lifka itself, running along the ravine in the gully. And then from there, they would have this really important access point, including a paved road, to enter into Konstantinivka directly. And the only sort of obstacle along the way would be Bilohora itself. To the contrary, this main highway over here requires overrunning Plashivka and Ivanopilia, so it could be slightly more difficult, especially given the high Ukrainian troop concentration in that region. You look over here at Pochki, the Russian forces captured nearly 1 square kilometer of territory, and they were able to reach the southern tip of the suburb. So you can see this is from June 18th. The Phoenix unit, not to be mistaken with the previous Phoenix regiment, they are a part of the 5th Assault Brigade, and they conducted FPV strikes, destroying a shed that a Russian soldier was hiding in. And that shed was geolocated to over here, southern tip of the village, and that gives us a proper indication that nearly the entirety of the settlement is under Russian control. And there are paved routes that basically bisect Pochki and then make their way to Pratichny, meaning that this will naturally become another target for the Russian side, but they first need to ensure that they are sort of accounted for on the eastern flank. So you do have some Ukrainian resistance, not anything too bloated, but you can see how the salient is formed. It's not really based around any fortifications or any houses besides this one over here, this small agricultural, maybe not agricultural, but just small shed over here. And it sort of branches out into the quarry, and then from there into this really vast network of fields and, to a lesser degree, trenches that are running along the areas west of the canal. So all of these areas could be threatened by a capture of Pochki, which would give the Russian side their assets in the area a really strong forward operating base to begin exerting pressure from the north, and also to begin advances westwards along the T0504 highway, including the capture of Pertichny, as that would be the final village in the way of the Russian line of contact and actually entering into Konstantinivka. But after the Predichny village, you do have at least two layers of trenches that need to be overrun. So that will be, again, a part of Russia's longer term planning over here, trying to couple that with the advances coming from the Turetsk region. And as I forgot, the Russians are actually now engaged in the process of just sort of squeezing out the Ukrainian resistance, which is very heavy in Yablonivka. So the Ukrainians, naturally, they were unable to retain control over large swaths of open fields, but coalesced around the village of Yablonivka itself. So all the reinforcements that came in to sort of stabilize the situation, they were unable to do it in the fields. But once they were able to get this sort of proper acclimation and were able to have soldiers stationed in basements, that's when the situation began to stabilize. And obviously, there's always going to be some sort of lower lying, not necessarily pause, but just decrease in sustained operations after major captures are conducted. So you could see over here the Russians advanced 0.9 square kilometers. There is a geolocation here. This is from the 12th Azov National Guard Brigade. They are now deployed to this area to a certain degree, which is not too far fetched because they were previously operating in areas that are essentially near Novospassky and Shcherbenivka. They may still even be there, but only dispatched a certain battalion to defend over here. But as you guys can see, these parts of the front line that were previously completely distinct, they're now beginning to sort of mesh into the same area and taking over the same responsibilities. So the Russians advanced what amounts to be, let's see, 1 kilometer northwards into Alexandro Kalinove, and the village here is of two infantry fighting vehicles getting destroyed. But nonetheless, you can see how the salient is formed around Yablonivka, the center of the village in particular, whereas the western side is now under Russian control. And then from there, the objective that is just as important is neutralizing and taking over the entirety of the trench network north of the populated area, which is located at a high elevation. And Ukrainian infantry will probably be involved in dragging out the fighting, engaged in small arms clashes with the Russian side. But the Russians have the advantage of attacking from two prongs, which will pin down Ukrainian soldiers, expose them from the rear, and then from there give the Russians the ability to focus all of their efforts jointly on the T0504 highway leading into Konstantinivka from the southwest. So obviously keep that in mind. Let's finish off with Sumy. There is an update from Sumy. As I said at the beginning of the video, there were actually two. So, first of all, the Russian forces, as reported by deep states, they have been able to take over the entirety of Woleshnia and the nearby trenches from the Surovikin era and hedgerows that the Russian side previously had under their control before the Kursk offensive even started. The final remnants, vestiges of the Kursk operation along this axis have been completely quelled and taken over, but there may be some Ukrainian presence noted slightly north of the border between Sumy and Kursk, basically in this area sandwiched in between the border, the international border, and the Psel River. This may be the only location where there is still some form of Ukrainian presence, even if it is not permanent, that is operating. And besides that, the entirety of Kursk is obviously under Russian control, including now Oleshnia. And from there, not only were they able to take over this possession in Kursk, but they also secured control over open areas and forested patches that are located east of Luknaya and within Sumy itself. So it amounts to 14 square kilometers. So it is a significant advance in that regard. And more generally, you have over here all these areas falling into Russian hands, really being at high elevation. You can see that over here with the territory taken over by the Russian side. Basically, anything that's sandwiched in between lines of villages is located on a really important ridge. And you can see how that's sort of formulated and manifested over here with these perimeters marking those sort of ridges. And then you have this valley line that runs along the new Ukrainian defensive layer, basically the one from Yablonivka, which is currently under Russian control, to Yunakivka, and it's located on a rather low elevation. And basically, you see the same thing a bit to the west with all these other smaller hamlets that are running along the same sort of highway that are also on a relatively low elevation compared to some Ukrainian rear positions and also compared to the territory that the Russians are currently capturing. So when we look at Yablonivka, they were able to capture 1.23 square kilometers of territory just west of the village, and just to the south, they captured another half a square kilometer. So now you can see how the western flank around Nikivka is beginning to strengthen. The Russians have opted not to conduct a head-on assault into the town. Rather, they are trying to improve the base to the east and cut off the road network, for instance. You can see that over here. And then the pressure is beginning to mount. It's coming in from the east as well, in addition to the Yublanivka vector from the west. So there's a potential to push in from this location over here following the success in Oleshnia and just squeeze out the Ukrainians by that sort of means. And there isn't a nearby village that could be really replicable for the sort of utility from a logistics organizational standpoint that the Ukrainians have had with this village for a very long time. Since the beginning of the Kursk operation, frankly, you look at it, the nearby, the closest village of any sort of notable scale that was involved in these sort of command and control activities is 9 kilometers southwards, and it's Mahorizia, certainly another Russian target throughout the unfolding of the Sumy operation. But I want to finish off by talking about the Army Corps. So the Ukrainians just created the first ever Army Corps that operates under the banner of the Territorial Defense Forces. So just to be clear, there have been Territorial Defense Brigades that have been assigned to Army Corps that are within the armed forces of Ukraine, within the regular army. There are a lot of good examples, like I think 118th, 120th Territorial Defense Brigades within the what is it? I think they were in the 20th Army Corps, and they are not necessarily deployed with all of their fellow units that are within that structure. And that's another key issue that I've seen with the Army Corps. It was meant to really replace the operational tactical groupings that have formed over the past 3 years within Ukraine's command structure, and was supposed to create a core system that is more down to earth and wherein all the units are actually operating within the same sort of operational zone, not necessarily the same locations, but along the same front line to a certain degree. So there could be sort of connection and dispersion of resources from the headquarters of the core could be done more efficiently. But as we're seeing, it's been like 3 or 4 months since the system has been introduced, and you have the 20th Corps, you have the 30th Marine Corps, you have the 7th and 8th Air Assault Corps, you have the 3rd Azov Corps, and you have the 17th and 18th and 19th Corps that we don't have much information about. But a lot of the units within these corps, they simply are not operating on the same wavelength as their compatriots, their brethren from the other units. So you have, for instance, forces deployed to the Luhansk front operating within the same army corps as ones in Zaporozhye or in Donetsk. So the problem is, and you could understand the issue, that the Ukrainians don't necessarily want to rotate out all their forces and cause this sort of mass chaos when it comes to shifting everything around, shifting all the chess pieces from one location to another, just to ensure that all of the army corps are operating in tandem. But that's why I don't understand why these units were grouped together in the first place. The Ukrainians sort of just simply grouped the same units that were operating along similar parts of the front line under the same banner, under the same Army Corps, and just kept the status quo. And that would have streamlined the process much more. And I understand the exceptions for Marine and air assault units because of their specifications, but I'm talking about the 20th Corps, the 19th Corps. There are so many examples of units from these umbrella groupings they're simply not acting in tandem. And I want to see now what happens with the 21st Corps because, once again, the idea is that it's supposed to be sort of like a territorial defense corps themed structure. But there are already elements of the territorial defense sort of apparatus that are a part of Army Corps. So, what's going to happen to them? Are they going to remain a part of the existing Army Corps that they were assigned to, or will they be redirected to new TDF corps that are being established per the request of Sierski? So, I don't know how that's going to end up playing out in reality. But that's all for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.